Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. As always, I'm Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. Today with me today is Sara Sutton, the CEO of Flexjobs. And I wanted to ask you, Sara, when you're looking at the remote work, I know that LinkedIn has been reporting that the number of remote jobs has been decreasing, I think by 25% from 20 to 15% since the start of the year. What do you think will be the trend with remote jobs going forward?
I think remote jobs are here to stay.
Mhm.
It was natural for it to have a pendulum swing a little bit back towards fewer,
Mhm.
as the pandemic really forced employers into embracing remote work. And over the last year and a half, we've seen kind of continued shifts as employers have to evaluate whether it fits for their culture and also to make the necessary changes to make it fit in their culture. And then also understanding that to recruit talent nowadays, it's a big benefit to have remote and hybrid because while job
Mhm.
postings might be decreasing at the current time, and also the employment market's a little tighter in different ways. There are a lot of reasons why job seekers want remote work, and those
Mhm.
reasons are not going away. And so employers, I believe, as things recover, will continue to feel pressure to offer remote work. And therefore, even if it might not have been their default decision, it is going to be a decision they're going to have to contend with and likely adapt to in increasing ways.
Now, something I've been curious when I've been observing both with my own clients, but more broadly from surveys, is that there are certain companies that are more likely to offer remote work and certain companies that are less. It looks like the companies that are least likely are the smallest businesses, 10 to 50 people, so under 50 people. Then the next one is in the middle is larger companies, so 5,000 and above. But the companies that are 500 people to 5,000 people seem like middle market companies, seem like they're the most likely ones to offer remote work. Do you have any read on why that might be?
Um, I honestly don't know if I'd agree with that from
Okay,
the information I've seen. I think it's difficult citing data because there is data from so many different sources,
okay.
and I'm not familiar with that specific set. I would say that larger organizations have more infrastructure to create formalized programs around them. So I think they might also be more likely to report formal programs for remote and hybrid work.
Okay,
And they also likely have more measurements in place, hopefully have more measurements in place in terms of the ROI. That was not historically true at all. Although I do hope with the pandemic and the great kind of translation into remote work, into more offices, that they are tracking that information. Um, I would say that it really depends from our side, more industry specific or role specific, as opposed
Mm,
to size of company. I think a lot of small entrepreneurial organizations and entrepreneurs in general, it probably depends on how you define a small business, are remote friendly and
yeah,
tend to lean to that because it can be a huge benefit to entrepreneurs and smaller organizations to save on overhead costs and recruit talent. So I think that the trends we'll see are well, it's always interesting to do trends in this space. There's always examples of the outliers, and some of them are very loud examples of
sure.
outliers. But I think that companies of all sizes will be embracing remote work and
Mhm.
integrating it. And I think at all sizes, small, medium, and enterprise, they're going to have examples of companies who are firmly sticking they're putting their foot down and saying they're not going to have remote work or something along those
Sure.
lines. But the majority of all organizations, I believe, will have hybrid and remote work.
Mhm. What I'm seeing is that from some of the clients I talk with and both industry companies, others, what I'm seeing is that companies that really prize talent, where talent is really important, are the ones that are offering more remote work. So, for example, startups are offering more remote work because talent is more important to them. Whereas companies that are more reliant on systems and processes that can slot in maybe shall we say more mediocre talent or talent that's not specialized, that's not at the top,
Hmm.
20%, tend to be less likely to offer remote work. I don't know if that's something you've observed. What do you think of that?
I think that's a pretty dangerous generalization, personally.
Okay.
While it might be true in some applications, and I think a lot of employers might view it that way, I think therein lies
Hmm.
the danger. I think thinking that
How so?
it's only average performers who can or should do certain kinds of work, and only high performers do another kind,
Hmm.
especially with work style, I think is quite different and dangerous. I also think that there's a lot of different traits that go into who makes a good remote worker that goes beyond just skill. Things like being an introvert, or being
Hmm.
particularly disciplined, or having a
Yeah.
certain work life situation that where you need and highly value remote work, can certainly incentivize people to be better employees and to be more engaged and productive in ways that might not be quantified by a simple kind of task. I think on the flip side, there's lots of remote work roles that are kind of more, there might not be deep in process, but they are kind of
Hmm.
automate. They're able to be replicated. Things like customer support and data entry and even writing, things like that, which might be light in
Hmm.
process, but depending on the employer's definition of like skill set, is it a replaceable role? Yes, it's a more easily replaceable role than others. So
Hmm.
I personally would say it's too early to identify, and I think there's just too many exceptions to the rule to
Yeah.
make a straight assessment of who and how this will fit well, because it also
Hmm.
depends on the company culture. Certain company cultures are more willing to be innovative, and it comes down to how they are managing their workers and to what is an efficient worker. If the management isn't again, it depends on all the different industries, but uh,
Hmm.
you have to have best practices management, I think, is very effective in remote work. I
Yes.
think you'll see problems with management much faster with remote work.
Hmm.
As on the flip side, I think you'll see problems with workers much faster if you have good management. It's the remote workers
Hmm.
that will slide through if you're not managing well. So I think a lot
Hmm.
of remote work can up level different organizations in how they are managing, whether the person is in the office, hybrid, or remote. So I don't know if that helps, but it's, yeah, I
Fantastic.
worry a little bit about some of the mass generalizations that are happening about the types of work
Hmm.
that can happen.
Hmm. No, that makes sense. And I appreciate, again, I'm talking from my experience and working with some clients, also from talking about trends and industry generalizations. What I'm seeing is that when I talk with clients who help transition to hybrid work and remote work, the start of the conversation tends to be, well, what's my industry doing? I'm recently starting to engage with a financial services firm, and their first question is, what are other financial services firms doing? And then I turn that around and say, well, let's put that aside and see what's going to be best for your firm, for your clients, for your culture, and your organization. Let's put aside what other firms are doing
Yeah.
and focus on what's going to achieve your goals. Have you seen that sort of dynamic where firms are too looking outside of what others are doing and trying to do social norms, maybe so to speak, rather than looking inside and thinking what's really going to be best for our own culture and our own goals and our own mission going forward?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that,
Mm,
I couldn't agree more with your advice with them. I think it's understandable. I mean, people are looking for benchmarks of all sorts, and they're
yeah.
looking for something that can be tried and true and trusted. And the nature of remote work is that it can be custom, and it should be
Mhm.
custom. And in order to work as effectively as it can for your organization, really understanding that it's not just a top-down mandate, or
Mm.
a tool that is great for recruiting because you can offer it as a benefit with no real expenditure or very little expenditure, and is a buzzword. But it's really about kind of the deeper, like, what's going to work in this role. And
Mm.
I encourage organizations to not view remote work as something that's arbitrary and
Mhm.
something that, and this is kind of where it's happened. Like the pandemic forced remote work on
Yeah.
organizations in a way that they kind of, a lot of organizations that had been kicking and screaming against remote work,
Mhm.
within a year, we're saying, oh, now we get it. We're gonna embrace remote work. Well, if you're an organization that's been kicking and screaming against it for 15 years prior, and all of a sudden you say it's flipped, how deeply have you embraced that? And I think that these last
Mhm.
couple of years and moving forward, companies, even if they want to embrace it, are really looking like, well, how do we do this, and who's doing it better? And
Mm.
also, can we, if none of our competitors are doing it, is it okay if we don't really do this right now, or we rush it, or like it's not such a high priority for us. And so, you know, I understand, but I think at the end of the day, that approach, well, you can learn some interesting lessons in how people are doing, how other organizations are doing it, and consider how to apply that. It still comes back to who you are as an organization. What do the team members in your organization want? And that can be different teams, different locations, different cohorts within the organization. But really understanding how is this going to affect our culture? What is our culture? How does it translate into a remote and hybrid world? And kind of testing and iterating on it as you go through. I'm not sure what you advise your clients, but I'd be curious if you don't mind sharing a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I definitely advise them to first, once they're figuring it out, okay, what do you want to achieve? What are your goals? Then what are your metrics? What are your criteria? So figure out the criteria that you're making for the transition to whatever permanent future work arrangements you want to make. So I'm working with a client right now, and we're looking at 14 criteria, and then we're going to weigh those criteria and then choose the top 5 to optimize against. And then looking at the various approaches to the future of work, everything from allowing to having only hybrid work, to allowing anyone to do what they want, to having team-based approaches, role-based approaches. How will those compare given the known outcomes for each of these approaches, which there's research about and I have some practice to inform them about? How will those compare to the criteria that you selected for your goals? And then we're going to select an approach in a team offsite meeting, because it's a very strategic decision. It's kind of permanent post-pandemic work arrangements. And then we're going to start implementing it. And of course, we'll also getting some surveys of employees, what their sentiments are. And then we'll have metrics, success metrics based on the criteria. And then we'll see how the success metrics compare to our initial desires for success metrics. And then we'll have experiments that looking at, okay, here's the policy, how's it going? Can we improve it? And are we going to improve our success metrics? Or how are those success metrics going to be impacted based on how we change our policy? So that's the general approach that I have with clients.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you for sharing. I think that's it's really in line with what we've recommended, and overall just making sure you're getting kind of at least pulse checking what your teams want. You know, what do employees actually want? So that
survey is very important.
You know, yeah, and even from the beginning standpoint, it doesn't mean you're definitely not gonna be able to provide everybody everything they want. However, being able to see those directional trends and how they shift between different departments or areas of the company can be interesting too.
Now, so I want to go back to something you said about costs for remote workers. And what I've seen is definitely remote workers overall, on average, cost companies less. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, they're not limited to talent that lives within an hour of their office. And so they can hire talented people from wherever. And also, based on research experience, remote workers are willing to work for somewhat less than in-office workers, because naturally, you don't have to pay as much for coming into the office if you're a remote worker, and people have a preference for remote work. I'm curious, what has been your perspective on that in terms of the costs for remote workers, where it seems like it costs companies less to hire good talent if that talent is remote?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely cost savings on both sides from our experience. Historically, pre-pandemic, we would average about 10 to 15% kind of like it'd be in the range. A role should be in the range of what you'd expect to make in an office within maybe 10 to 15%. And sometimes that would be it would be primarily for the reasons you outlined, either geographic reasons or kind of the lifestyle reasons, and the flexibility of not having to commute and the cost savings. It wasn't explicitly stated that the cost savings you're experiencing as a remote worker we're trying to get back, but yes, I think that those were reasons that remote workers would kind of sacrifice to take the job. I do think that component is shifting, with remote work being so much more prevalent than it was. There's still a lot more demand for remote work than there are fully remote jobs. So there is still, I think, a willingness to accept a little less. However, we also have job seekers regularly who find jobs who pay more than they would have gotten in one of their, and partially for the geographic reasons, they find jobs that actually pay more than what their local economy would support. And that's really exciting. I mean, it's a win-win for a lot of organizations and people. So I would say that, yeah, I think that it's been an interesting discussion around normalizing salaries. And I know Automatic and some other leading remote or big remote companies have been playing with that the same pay for the same role, no matter where you are. I don't personally think that that's practical for the majority of organizations.
Agreed.
Just quite simply because the bar is too high if you're competing in somewhere like San Francisco or London or Paris, and you can't, like, it raises the bar so high that smaller organizations definitely can't compete on that. But I think that the cost savings is real. I mean, between 5,000 to 10,000 a year for a remote worker generally, and that can be everything in certainly commute costs and wear and tear on your car, but also childcare costs for the time you spend commuting. So I never propose that people are saving on childcare and watching their kids while they work. However, if you had a 2-hour commute and you're having to pay for 2 hours extra a day of childcare, that's a significant savings. There's also attire, what your wardrobe is, and if you used to have to get dry cleaning and things like that, and eating out. And there's a lot of different areas around that. And then on the employer side, I think the geographical component is very real. I also think that there's, it depends on the different organization, how they have a cost per hire in terms of what is they need equipment wise from a real estate standpoint and all the everything that they need to work. Whereas that bar is a little lower with remote work typically, with a lot of organizations giving stipends for remote workers, but not necessarily paying for their desk and their printer and their office and their monitors and things like that. Different organizations do it differently, but yeah, so I think there's some win-win elements in that, and the cost benefits have long been and will continue to be a compelling argument to support remote work.
Agreed. Also, I think another compelling argument that I've seen increasingly is diversity, equity, inclusion. So Meta came out with a report showing that its DEI plan, which was made in 2019, 5-year DEI goals, it met them in 3 years, in 2022, because it offered remote work, and the applicants for remote positions were much more diverse than the applicants for in-office positions. And we've also seen that for people with disabilities. So we've seen that people with disabilities, just like for people without disabilities, their employment rate dropped at the beginning of the pandemic. Now the employment rate for people without disabilities recovered to just 1.1% below what it was before the pandemic. But for people with disabilities, it's 3.5% above what it was before the pandemic. And just seems like it's due to remote work. So people with disabilities are, of course, especially benefited by remote work. What's been your take from what you've observed from what Flexjobs has seen on specifically DEI questions and remote work?
Well, first, I have to say, I'd love to see that data, especially on the disability component. That is what we see as well. And in general, it's a really powerful thing to be able to include more people in work. And there's a lot of people who've been excluded from a traditional workforce, and that can be, as we've said, it could be working moms or parents. It can be people from military spouse backgrounds, or people who live in rural or economically depressed areas that don't have access to the talent market, but certainly people who have disabilities. And I also want to just reference visible and invisible disabilities.
Sure.
There's a lot of people with environmental issues that can't work, or other issues that might not be as transparent, but are very real and create very big hurdles for people to work in a traditional office. And so remote work has long been a way to include more people. And I think it's an exciting area. I know I'm working on a couple of different initiatives, but even one of them, and proposals on how to help make quadriplegics more included in the workforce with robotic arms and elements of how they could do remote work and empower them as well as their caretakers too, and allow them to have more independence. So there's a lot of powerful movement behind this. And so from the disability standpoint, I think even things like screen readers for visual impairments and disabilities that have come a long way because of the pandemic, because it's gotten more normalized. And I think that that's very exciting. I also think that the diversity side is really important. And I've seen a number of different articles and reports coming out finally with some data around the why people from minority groups really prefer remote work or certainly enjoy remote work, because it removes microaggressions that they experience, not just macro aggressions, but also the microaggressions that they experience, and they're able to work, their nervous systems are able to calm down and work in a much more efficient and, from their view, equal manner without a lot of kind of that ongoing premise of difference. So I personally will also speak to video. Well, we as an organization are remote and have been for over 15 years. And back in the day, the video wasn't that great, and we had too big of calls to do it, and the technical reasons were kind of what held us back. Over time, we actually realized, even as the technology gotten better, we don't lean on video. And in some cases, we intentionally don't use video in some interviews and things of that nature. So we keep things a little bit more democratic in a way. And we lean more on screen sharing and voice calls, honestly, in our organization, because the being in person can add layers of stress for people if they don't feel comfortable being seen and they feel that they're going to be judged in some way. So just to put that out there as kind of an ongoing, like even in a remote work environment, considering how you're handling your workforce, and are they working in a situation that feels the most comfortable and where they'll do the best work?
That makes a lot of sense. And there are other research showing that, for example, in remote environments, men tend to interrupt women more than the opposite. So that's another sort of problem that needs to be addressed. And I wanted to add about the disability, invisible disability. A lot of people with long COVID are experiencing invisible disability. So 1.7 more million Americans have become disabled. A lot of that is due to brain fog and fatigue. And that is an invisible disability that's coming out of the current situation that we really need to make sure that these people can enable themselves to stay in the workforce. Now,
absolutely, and as their caretakers as well. I mean, I just want to. The numbers start to really add up in all of these arenas when you start to consider it's not just in some cases the people who are working, but also their caretakers who are struggling with having a flexible job and or needing to be on call and help. So it's really a big pool of people. And I was at a recent summit and asked the audience, we're talking about disabilities, and I just said, like, can everyone just pause for a moment and think about people in your life who have either a visible or invisible disease, disability, and how many of them can that affect their work? And can you raise your hands? And so everyone in the room essentially raised their hands. And this is something that business leaders really need to be considering as they look at remote work, that this isn't a fringe benefit. This is a really important benefit that affects all of their team members, whether they know it or not, in some way of how also showing the care of an organization. And remote work helps you kind of, I think, put your money where your mouth is if you're saying you're an inclusive employer.
Absolutely. Now, as we finish up, can you help us understand how Flexjobs helps people find remote work, find hybrid work?
Sure. Well, since we've started, we have always worked with organizations in all industries, and also small, startup to Fortune 500, and in all roles and categories. So we have part-time to full-time. The majority of our jobs are full-time, and the majority of our jobs are employee status, although we also have freelance roles. And we have candidates come in, and they are, they're from all over, but they generally have a higher level of remote work. They're generally a little more educated, and they are very excited about and dedicated to remote work. Many of them also have worked in these areas for a while and have had experience. And so we help job seekers find quality companies who are offering remote and hybrid jobs. We go to great lengths to make sure every single job and company on the site is legitimate and professional and does offer flexibility. So we vet every single job and company. And the reason we do that is because definitely in this day and age, but it used to be more obvious, but there are a lot of scams out there in the work from home and remote markets. And again, some of them are very obvious, and job seekers think, oh, I'll be able to tell no problem. And yet it's one of the biggest multi-billion-dollar industries, and it's been on the FBI top 10 list, of warnings and of why to be aware that they're scams. So we make sure our database is very clean, and we help make the process as easy as possible and as friendly as possible for job seekers who are looking to have remote careers, find legitimate remote employers, and be good remote workers. So we have lots of content, webinars, virtual job fairs, career coaches, and other resources to help people in their remote work job search and then career beyond that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you so much for having me, Gleb. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And to our audience, I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.